Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight for the panel about Trump and the US election a year on. Tonight, we are in the very room that this time last year had a lot of flags, a lot of people, and then quite a lot of tears at the end of the evening. Hopefully, we'll have a repeat of that tonight, although we'll see what the panelists say. But tonight's panelists just give a quick introduction before they make their way in. Firstly, we have Kate Andrews. Kate is the news editor at the Institute of Economic Affairs. She previously worked as head of communications at the Adam Smith Institute and regularly features across the national media. Second, we have John Clark Levin. John Clark is an American author and journalist whose work covers the intersection of technology and politics and security. And then finally, we have Anna Cardoza. Anna's reading history at Trinity College, Cambridge. Originally from Chicago, she's now living in London, and she regularly writes for Varsity on American issues. So if we could have a hand for our three panelists, everyone. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and hopefully tonight's discussion will be both with our panelists here tonight, but also a real opportunity for everyone to raise questions that can be discussed up here and also amongst the audience. We'll try to do a couple of questions, including those that have been submitted and have been on Twitter with the panelists, and then we'll move out to the audience in the second half of the event. First of all, it would be really helpful. I've given a quick bio on each of you, but if you'd like to introduce yourselves in your own words and also why speaking on this panel was of interest tonight. So starting with John Clark.
Sure. So I am a second-year PhD student in politics at St. John's, and I think what really motivated me to come to this panel was that I come from fairly conservative circles back in America, and I was quite surprised and then dismayed to see how so many conservatives in America were disgusted by Trump during the primaries, but then once he was nominated by the Republican Party, so many of them found ways to rationalize and justify supporting him. So I hope to contribute some firsthand perspective on that phenomenon tonight.
Thank you. And Anna?
I'm Anna. I'm a second-year historian at Trinity. Why I'm here is I spend every waking moment, pretty much, of my free time torturing myself, reading the news about Trump, refreshing it, and just I felt like I had to talk about it, given that I was invited.
And Kate?
I'm Kate. Previously, in addition to my professional roles in London, I personally was the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. That ended when Trump became the nominee. I wasn't able to vote for Trump, but similar to John, I know many people who did, and I'm really interested in why people voted for Donald Trump, particularly in areas like the Rust Belt, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, where you had a lot of two-term Obama voters who moved to Donald Trump. I think a lot of the rhetoric around what Trumpism is related to what the media wants him to be and also what he says it is. What Trumpism is to his voters, I think, is very different and interesting. So hopefully we can get into some of that discussion tonight.
Well, thank you all. And I think to start with, we really wanted to reflect back on that election cycle and that process. So like you say, Trump became the nominee, and then we had a very entertaining, a very interesting election cycle that ended last November with a result that many were surprised by, but not all. It would be interesting to hear from all of you a year on. Do you still think that the election last year was surprising? Was it different? Was it shocking? Or actually, do you think that we just saw a typical run of the US elections, the same twists and turns and drama? Do you think it was exceptional in the way that many did characterize it at the time? Starting with you, John Clark.
Yes, It was exceptional. I think the New York Times, in its election morning forecast, was about 5% chance of Trump winning. That was a major underestimate of his chances. But I think Nate Silver of 538 was probably about right in saying Trump had about a 1 in 3 chance of taking it. And based on just the random variables of who turns out for any given election, I think if we had replayed the election 3 times under the same conditions, hypothetically, of course, Trump probably would have won about once and lost about twice. So I think Silver was actually probably right on there.
I think it was super surprising, and that's almost part of why Trump was elected. Like, you saw lots of people not turning out for Hillary Clinton because they didn't think they had to. She wasn't an amazing candidate. I mean, I think she was, but like, she didn't inspire the Democratic base, right? So lots of people assumed, because of all the election coverage, that, you know, she had it. It was so surprising because these people didn't turn out, and Trump won. It was horrifying.
Obviously it was surprising. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was surprised when I watched the peso crash in real time. I think everyone was pretty shocked. I'm not sure we should have been. Just historically, it's very difficult for one party to control the Oval Office for more than 8 years. That in and of itself was a favor to the Republicans. I'm going to be less generous to Hillary Clinton. She was an abysmal candidate. And now that we can look back on her election, you know, she lost the Rust Belt by under 100,000 votes. You know, it was 20,000 votes in this state, I think it was less than 10,000 votes in Wisconsin, or sorry, maybe it's Michigan, I can't remember which one, in which she lost the state by. I mean, this is just a badly run campaign. She actually shouldn't have lost those states, but she took them for granted. She didn't go campaign there. She thought they were in the bag. So I think in retrospect, we shouldn't be so surprised that the candidate who thought she was going to win and didn't even prepare a concession speech lost. Because voters can tell when someone feels entitled, and they clearly didn't like that. To me, what's much more surprising is the way that Trump has managed to rewrite the rules of an election campaign, and he has. And I'm concerned about that because I'm not sure how much we can backtrack from that in the next election cycles. And he made it a very lowbrow, very ugly campaign. It's something I really don't want to see happen in America again.
And it's interesting that you all mentioned the fact of not only those who did actively vote for Trump, but also that there was perhaps a complacency in this election. In spite of there being some quite big characters, you couldn't kind of stage it better than having Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump going head to head. Surely everyone would want to have a stakeholder in that. Why do you think that there was some complacency? And maybe touching, Kate, on what you were just addressing about those central states. Why do you think some people felt it was just for granted and so they didn't vote? Why was there that apathy there, do you think, on both sides?
Generally speaking, working class voters lean towards the Democratic Party. It really wasn't thought that Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin were swing states in this election. Minnesota ended up going for Clinton, but it was close on election night. So I think that, you know, just historically they thought that these are our voters. Now, overwhelmingly in the states, working class voters did vote for Hillary Clinton, but like I said, it didn't take all that many voters to move from 2 years under Obama to move to Trump, and then we saw him win that election. So I don't think the Clinton campaign was listening to grassroots on the ground. There were some reports coming out of Pennsylvania from her operative saying, look, your rhetoric is not helping. People think you're going to put them out of work. They think you're going to close down all different kinds of things where people have manufacturing jobs. And they didn't listen. And obviously, in retrospect, enough people felt nervous that they went the other way.
I'll add to that and say I was elated in summer 2016 that Trump was a Republican candidate. I mean, you're right. There is a history of America swinging to the other party when you've had an 8-year president. And I thought Marco Rubio was a much more competitive candidate against Hillary Clinton. I thought there's no way that America will elect this man. So I think Trump in particular made it surprising rather than the Republican Party.
I think what the election showed was just how strong the pull of partisanship is in the United States. And that's really a contrast with Britain. I know many people here who have voted for all three sort of major parties, who were Labor and Lib Dem, and then maybe Conservative and back and forth. In this country, people don't take it as such a fundamental part of their identity. Whereas in America, on both sides, but I would say more on the Republican side, people really feel that being a Republican or being a conservative is an important part of their identity. And so when people were faced with the choice of either voting for a guy who they themselves thought was kind of a monster, or voting for the Democrats instead, there was such psychological and social pressure from that partisanship to somehow find a way of rationalizing a Trump vote that the great majority of them did just that.
And that's interesting what you bring out there, because when Trump very early on announced that he might be running and a lot of people didn't take it seriously, those that did also asked what party would he be running for. And of course, he did donate to Hillary Clinton's earlier campaign. How do you think voters reconciled, the partisanship, voting for the party, when a lot of people still continue to question, and we'll move on to this now about the policy itself, question whether Trump really is a Republican? Kate, if you moved away from Republican overseas when he became the nominee, was that a big part of that? I imagine that was perhaps a tension that you had to navigate.
Absolutely. I mean, the main reason I did that was because at the time, Republicans overseas had the policy that we were going to support the nominee, and I couldn't do that publicly without having sort of pains in my stomach. So I stepped away from that. Trump does not represent the Republican Party. My fear is that he will end up doing so, is that the party will move with him towards economic nationalism, towards protectionism, towards this anti-immigration sentiment that Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush certainly did not have. That being said, I mean, I do appreciate John's point. The Republicans and the Democrats both came home, if you will. They voted for their party's nominee, and this issue of partisanship is an important one. But it's getting messier than that. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were not that far apart on economic policy. They really weren't. And even on the immigration points, these are two candidates that just weren't that far apart. Both of them were calling for socialized medicine. Both of them were essentially calling for intense government spending for infrastructure projects. They were both Keynesian to varying degrees. And I really think this idea that I'm going to push back a little bit, that the reason that Republicans voted for Donald Trump is because they're Republican, but they thought he was a monster. I just don't think it can be I don't think we can overlook what the other option was. That there are a lot of Republicans out there who I think would have voted for a Joe Biden, who would have voted for somebody who wasn't Hillary Clinton, because for every scandal you had against Trump, you did have one you can name against Hillary Clinton. Now, we can get into debate about whose scandals were worse. I would argue Donald Trump's were worse. But it doesn't change the fact that this was a really difficult election between the two most unpopular candidates in American history. I think it's really hard to try to pull out much data from that other than the fact that America was faced with a tough choice. And it was split. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Donald Trump won the electoral vote. I mean, this was a nitty-gritty election, and I think people are still feeling very decisive about it.
It is also difficult because you saw a lot of people swinging from having voted for Obama twice to Trump. So obviously there was, especially among long-term Republicans, maybe like middle-class Republicans, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton. I have a lot of family like that who didn't support Trump but still had to vote for the Republican Party. But you also see lots of working-class white people who historically vote for the Democrats, swinging to Trump. So I think the picture is a little bit more complicated than pure partisanship.
Yes, I didn't intend to say that's the only factor, but one wrinkle to that story is that for many of Trump's true supporters, and this includes some people who had previously been Democrats, what they seemed to really like about him, what appealed, wasn't his policies. It wasn't how he conducted himself with women or in business. It was his attitude. People felt, this guy's a fighter. This guy is going to shake things up. And for people who were rightly or wrongly unhappy with the status quo, Trump was sort of a grenade that they could lob into the Washington establishment, kind of blow it up, and then hope that something better would emerge. I would argue those hopes were not well-founded, they were not realistic, but in speaking to so many Trump supporters, especially the ones who were not so conflicted before the general election, again and again what they said was, it's his attitude. He's someone who will fight for me.
And it's clear that people voted for Trump or decided not to vote at all for a number of reasons. You described it is complex. Some of that would have been just trying to shake up the establishment. We have had 2017 with this new administration. It would be interesting to hear from your perspective. Do you think he's been successful? Do you think some of the hopes you mentioned have been realized? Maybe not all of them, but do you think there have been successes of this administration? I think we've had so many issues, many of them, for example, the headline ones, such as the Muslim ban or such as trying to reform the Affordable Care Act, seem to have not quite come to the outcomes that were promised, but people still have hope, and people have cited, for example, the economy as something that on a couple of metrics is looking up. Again, people dispute whether that is down to the current administration or previous ones. So an assessment of successes, failures, where you think this administration currently sits, having been in place for now most of 2017, maybe starting at this end.
Sure. I think before we can even really tackle that, if we could just zoom back for a moment. Many of Trump's voters, probably a solid majority, still support him strongly. And what we see from that is the American media landscape has divided very distinctly into two camps. On one side, there are outlets that report about what Trump is actually doing. Some of them are just straight down the line factual. Some of them are biased against Trump. But then there's another whole media ecosystem, like Fox News, like Breitbart, like InfoWars, that frankly just lies to people in many cases. And what that means is now Trump's supporters have been conditioned to dismiss any critical perspective about him, any bad news about him, as just liberal lies, left-wing lies, fake news. And what that means is that when Trump has policy failures, like you mentioned, his core supporters aren't really aware of them. What they see is the spin about how Trump is playing 12-dimensional chess, they say, and each defeat is really a victory in disguise, and he has some kind of real master plan, and he's got the liberals spinning around, and I mean, I think we pretty much all know in this room that's not what's happening. But from his supporters' perspective, because they close themselves off to contrary perspectives, I don't think they see him as having had many policy failures.
I think it's difficult because on the one hand, you see him pursuing, or at least attempting to pursue, the agenda he laid out in his campaign, right? So he has tried to put the Muslim ban in place. He has failed several times, but I think he's going to keep trying. I think he is making plans to put parts of like the wall building program in budgets. But then on the other hand, you have him completely deviating from his promises in the election. His healthcare plan was very Republican. It wasn't populist. It wasn't, for the people. It was for the elites. And same with the tax reform. So I think it's interesting to see his presidency kind of taking this like nationalist tack on one hand, but also being a traditional Republican on the other.
A few things. I think InfoWars is despicable, and I really think Fox News actually has gone off the deep end. But I don't buy this idea that Trump voters are living in some bubble of fake news any more so than the far left. I mean, if you look at these polls that come out about where people are getting their news from, you know, so much more of it is now online. The majority of people are now getting their news from Facebook, which just circulates your desired preference of news to show up at the top of your news feed. I think we are all living in bubbles, especially if you are someone who doesn't necessarily want to vote based on the facts. You want to vote on party preference, or if you want to vote emotionally rather than rationally, you're going to find the news that suits you. I don't believe that this is a phenomenon that's just affecting Trump supporters, that they were brainwashed when they made their decisions, and they will be again in 2020. This is affecting everyone. I also think if we think that Trump's supporters are just brainwashed, then, I mean, we won't deal with the actual reasons that Trump has been elected. I think they're very legitimate grievances from the people who brought in someone who I couldn't vote for, but I understand why they did. Most of, I think, what he's done so far, or what's happened in the past year, has pretty much been a failure. For the most part, that's been a good thing. His Muslim ban is ridiculous. His attacks on immigration are absolutely ridiculous. His ban on trans people in the military is going to the Supreme Court, which is excellent. That should not take place. He's rolled back some decent regulation on business that I think is going to stimulate the economy, and we'll see on tax reform. I disagree with you on tax reform. I don't think it's really for the elite. I think finally we're getting some simplification, and most people's taxes are going to be cut. This is a good thing. Crucially, what every president for the past 20 years has had the opportunity to do is to bring trillions of dollars from overseas back to America to invest in business with a one-time corporation tax cut. If he pulls this off, the economy is going to go crazy, and the Democrats better be ready in 2020. I actually think he could win re-election. Don't want him to, but I think that's a very real possibility. One last positive I would point to, but this is not in Trump's favor, is that finally, I think there's cross-party support once again for the Constitution and for its protection of citizens underneath it. I mean, you have people who were basically saying 8 years ago that the Constitution was outdated and we should throw it out the window, now saying, no, President Trump, there are rules and you are bound to them just like everybody else. I think this is a really positive moment. Maybe it took someone like Donald Trump to make it happen, but luckily the systems in America are very, very strong, and I think that they can outlast someone like Trump, and we all might be safer after that fact.
Just one thing, if I could respond to, Kate, on the issue of the media divide between right and left. Excluding the people who were literally masked Antifa operators, most people who consider themselves on the left have not closed themselves off to more centrist media.
Look at the Canary. I mean, let's look at what's happening in this country. I mean, the media hits that some of these outlier groups are getting, like the Canary or InfoWars, it's insane. And I'm not making any accusation against any individual, but I just think this idea that Trump supporters have been brainwashed, but say Bernie Sanders supporters weren't. I wouldn't say either of them have been brainwashed, but I think everyone is cherry picking. That's the only point I'm making. I think everyone is cherry picking information to suit what they want to believe and where they want the system to go.
Yeah, certainly it's happening on both sides.
Yeah.
Just my diagnosis is that it's more on Trump's side, but reasonable people can certainly disagree.
And it's interesting, we've touched upon the Constitution and the way that Trump as a candidate is sometimes seen to be pushing against the Constitution and the checks and balances in place, but also proving that they do exist. One area in which the information and the media that we're talking about comes into play with that is his, it seems, quite constant attacks on the press and the freedom of the press, whether what they're reporting is correct, what they should be allowed to report. What are your thoughts on the kind of narrative still coming out of the White House press office and the quite antagonistic relationship that Donald Trump has built up with not just press on the left, but even in the center and on the right in some cases? John Clark, do you want to start? And then...
Sure. So, one of the really striking things that Trump said very early in his presidency was that the press is, quote, the enemy of the American people. That is genuinely stunning rhetoric from the most powerful man in the world. That is something that none of his predecessors would have countenanced. And what that supports, I think, is that continuing cleavage between his supporters and his opponents, such that his supporters are becoming more and more impervious to what the critical free press says about him, because he's characterizing them in such strong terms, not merely saying they're not reporting fairly about him, but casting them as separate from and against the American people. So I would highlight that as the most shocking instance of Trump's opposition to the press. But beyond that, he's also repeatedly made threats about opening up the libel laws, as he says, to make it easier to sue journalists who write things that he doesn't like, or perhaps pulling the broadcast licenses of television news that is critical of him. And people say, rightly, that constitutionally he probably couldn't get away with that, but even the act of making the threats is already chilling freedom of the press. Already, I know several journalists who've expressed reluctance to report on Trump because of the deluge of death threats that they will get on Twitter and elsewhere as a result. And so, if you are, say, the spouse of a working political journalist now, and you know that if your spouse reports something very negative about Trump, you may get Polaroids in the mail of your kids on the playground at school. You're probably going to tell your spouse, maybe let another journalist handle that, and that's a very dangerous position to be in.
I mean, any one of the scandals that has rocked the Trump administration so far would have been a massive deal in any other administration. It's been both fascinating and totally depressing to see that people just not believing headlines about Trump. Trump supporters they don't believe New York Times, The New Yorker, when they report on all these scandals. As a side note, it's also been interesting to see Steve Bannon's role in the administration, to see Donald Trump take in these kind of extremist media branches into his administration. Steve Bannon had a massive impact on Trump. He's still a political advisor. He's still a massive ally, even if he's not in the White House anymore. Obviously, the relationship between the media and politicians has always been complicated, and there have always been newspapers in favor of certain politicians. It's interesting that Trump has taken Alex Jones and Steve Bannon as his representatives. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, it's deeply concerning. Any attacks on the free press, especially coming from the most powerful man in the world, are deeply concerning. I think Anna and John have made those points very well, so I won't say too much more about it. The only other thing I would note is that when you have a president who takes things this far, I think it's very, very easy to lose sight, again, like I was saying before, about the structures that are in place. I think it was one of you that was saying that, we can probably weather this. But my biggest concern about Trump within the Republican Party and in Washington as a whole is that he's dumbing down the caliber of what that office is. He's dumbing down the caliber of the party. He's dumbing down the caliber of debate. And it cannot become okay for a candidate to attack the free press. We can weather this for now. I'm not scared for the free press. I think the free press will be able to continue to operate in the States. But I don't know how long it can weather that for, whether it's 4 years or 8 years or 2 decades. We need to roll this back very quickly when we can.
And some people would even go as far to say that we can't weather it, within the completion of this term. For a lot of people and a lot of the articles that have been on Trump by those people who have decided to write increasingly and as a lot of people left the administration at the start of this year, were about impeachment, were about how long will he last. In looking up information for this panel tonight, finding the number of different T-shirts you can get that will count down the number of days or have the very date in which Trump is going to leave office. But as you mentioned, Kate, he may well run for a second term, and so that date is not fixed, and you might need to update the T-shirt. But more importantly, people are saying either he might get a second term or he might go next week. It's not something that I think we've seen with many presidents in the recent past, that there's such volatility about whether they'll still be in office week to week. Do you think that that is something different and in some ways constructive that he has brought? Do you think that that's something that is detrimental and detracting from what the office of the President of the United States should be? And do you think it would be helpful, whether it's impeachment or just stepping down as such, do you think it would be helpful for Trump to step out of his own way? So maybe starting with Kate and then leading on that.
Sure. I mean, after 2016 and 2017, I would dare anybody to make a prediction. None of us can know if he's going to run for office again, if he'll be impeached. We'll see what happens with the Russia investigation. My suspicion, not a prediction, but a suspicion, is that he's not going to be impeached. It's an incredibly difficult process to impeach the President of the United States. And the grounds that you need to do it, he really would have had to commit some kind of treasonous act without this being seen as an attempt to upset the democratic will of the electorate in 2016. So I think he is probably with us till 2020. Then the question is, does he throw up his hands and say, I drained the swamp, I came here, I did what I wanted to do, and he leaves because he hates it, because all the reports are that he hates being president? That's very possible. Or can he just not resist the challenge? I mean, there's so many questions. What does the economy look like? What do the polling numbers look like when it comes to that? I do think, again, overall, this hurts. This hurts America. One of the best things that George Washington ever gave us as president wasn't just literally America, but he decided that there were going to be term limits. He didn't want to be a king. And so, for a president to want to run for a second term is not, in my view, a bad thing. To want 8 years to get the job done is not a bad thing. So yeah, all this talk of impeachment, all this volatility about 2020, it's not helpful. It's too political. We actually need some policy and governing. And I don't feel like we've had that really since 2015, when everybody started talking about the election.
I don't know what is going to come out of Mueller's investigation. What has come out so far is crazy, as it is. Manafort and his money laundering and Papadopoulos and all the interviews have been crazy. So it's something dramatic, but it would have to be very dramatic for it to topple him. I don't know.
I think for perspective, even though we've seen a lot in the news about Mueller's investigation lately, we should remember this will probably be the largest and most complex peacetime criminal investigation in American history. And so even optimistically, this is not something that would close in on Trump in any decisive way until next summer or just before the midterm elections. And so even though I suspect from what we've seen so far that what comes out will be pretty devastating to Trump, this is not going to be the sort of thing where he resigns next week because of some new disclosure. But the way Trump and his administration are acting is guilty as sin. I mean, just one example of this, there are certainly very many, but George Papadopoulos, who was the former Trump foreign policy advisor who recently pled guilty to lying to the FBI, was one of Trump's top 5 foreign policy advisors during the campaign, and he was touted as such by the campaign in the press. He was in the gallery. This guy is one of the top 5. Once he pled guilty and that came out, the administration started furiously spinning, distancing themselves from Papadopoulos. And one of Trump's surrogates, a man named Michael Caputo, literally said with a straight face on national television, he was the coffee boy. It's not just that they're lying, it's that they're not even lying well. It's the difference between a kid telling his teacher, "The dog ate my homework," versus telling the teacher, "A unicorn ate my homework." I mean, it's just a disrespectful kind of lie that doesn't even aim for plausibility.
I will say that I don't know if he will be impeached or not. It does feel like the build-up to Watergate. Like reading about Watergate, it kind of emerged slowly, and then one aide fell, and then the next aide fell, and then finally Nixon fell. So it feels like it's moving in that direction. Let's see if it actually does or not, but you never know.
I wouldn't be too optimistic if you want Trump to get impeached. Look, anything could come out of these Russian investigations, and I have no idea. Could Trump be somebody who might get up to no good and collude with the Russians? It strikes me as someone who doesn't follow the rules. So this is not out of the realms of possibility. But these investigations are going to have to directly link Donald Trump to colluding with the Russians in order to influence the election. It's not going to be someone who was close to him or someone who worked for him at one time and colluded with the Russians at another time. They're going to have to draw this link with evidence. Could it happen? Absolutely. But I am not ready to come out and say that this is the solution to tackling Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not.
Yeah, for sure.
We have to start thinking a lot bigger and broader about, I think, why he won and about what all of us need to do. It doesn't matter if you're left-wing, right-wing, Republican, Democrat, Labor, Conservative, doesn't matter. We have to start thinking about why someone like him won and what all of us are going to do about it.
And I think on that, it might be quite helpful to move out to questions, and people might want to pick up on, what can we do about it? What role do we all play? It looks like we've got lots of questions, and all that I would ask is that when I indicate to take your question, please do say it on a microphone so that we've got a good number of people actually watching online and so that they can hear as well. So if we start over here on the left, if we take your question first, and then back there in the blue shirt, if you could make sure the microphone goes to them now, and then we'll take some questions from the center as well. So I will come to you. Starting over here.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm from Queen's College. I just wanted to build on what Kate said and have everyone kind of talk about why did you think Trump was elected, and was he rightly seen as the anti-establishment candidate, or has he built himself up as that and now has proven that he really wasn't?
John Clark?
I think he was certainly an anti-establishment candidate in the sense of being against the established military leadership, against our intelligence community, against much of the civil service and the executive departments and the scientists who work for the federal government. So anti-establishment in that sense. But I think implicit in the anti-establishment label is the idea that someone will be then for the people instead of for the establishment, and he has not been for the people.
I mean, I've always found the idea that Trump was the anti-establishment candidate so galling. I mean, he's a billionaire from New York who's been donating to political campaigns his whole life. He got a small donation from his dad of $1 million to start his business. The people who ran his campaign, Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, they were part of the people who put up the swamp, the institutions. They were the most powerful lobbyists in Washington at one point, And yeah, I think his administration has reflected the fact that he was never anti-establishment to begin with. He was nationalist, he was populist, but I don't think he was ever a proper anti-establishment candidate, personally. You may disagree.
No, I agree. We had 2 millionaire New Yorker insiders running against each other for president. And so he painted himself as the anti-establishment figure. And compared to Hillary Clinton, he could do that, but of course he wasn't anti-establishment. I completely agree. Why do I think Trump was elected? It's a really complex question. So a short and simple answer, which I'm sure can be broken down further, is that you have Republicans and Democrats, but you also have city versus country, liberal, small L liberal versus small c conservative. And what this election showed is that the people outside the cities felt completely left behind. I've got a lot of sympathy for that, because if you're paying taxes to any state, especially in America, where infrastructure is not as good as it is throughout most of Europe, majority of that money is going to public services within the cities, to improve the tube lines, to improve the roads there. You're not seeing it where you are. Public school education in the States is really not very good in most areas. It's abysmal. and healthcare in particular. I mean, I still think one of the reasons Donald Trump actually won was because of Obamacare, because for most people, those premiums have doubled. Obamacare was not the NHS. It was not free healthcare for people. Most people have seen their premiums and their insurance double. And that's a tough pill to swallow. And I think people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be 8 more years of Obama, but she wasn't nearly as charming, and she wasn't nearly as likable. And so they really didn't want to go for her. And they were willing to take a chance on this rogue, awful figure who, lies all the time, but made a very good point in coming across and saying sometimes what he was bad about. Look, I gave to the Hillary Clinton campaign so that I could build my buildings in New York. I bought off the politicians. You can't buy me. I mean, he had this way of talking that would have been so appealing to people who felt like their money was being taken from them and not invested back into them. I think that's the simple reason as to why Trump ended up being more successful than most of us could see coming.
No, thank you for unpacking that there. I think what I'll do now is take another 3, and I will note them down so you don't all have to keep on your toes. But if we take the one just in the blue shirt there, and then take in the front row here, and I'll take the front row here as well. So if you want to say your question.
Hello, I'm Ivan from Sydney Sussex College, and I want to ask, so obviously the most natural, most normal way to end a president's presidency is to make him lose the election. And what I want to ask you about is, what do you think would be a good strategy for the Democrats for 2020? And it's quite early, but what do you think? Not just in terms of not having someone with email scandals and rigging the DNC, but should they run someone left-wing like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren? Would that be the evening strategy, someone centrist? How should they approach the issues you mentioned about country and city, bridging partisanship, maybe working class, winning back the working class? So what would be the winning strategy for Democrats in 2020?
Thank you. And then if we take the one just in the front row here. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have basically 3 issues you raised. A, the Constitution, B, partisanship, and 3, patriotism. Why is it that in the US, the Republican Party became the party of patriotism, and if you're not a Republican, you're anti-Constitution, you're anti-patriotic? How has the Republican Party basically usurped this monopoly on what is American? And how has it influenced the election?
Thank you. And then we'll just take the third one across here. Yeah,
Thanks.
go ahead.
Theo from Jesus College. I just wanted to find out from the panel what they thought about how Trump's election, but also some of the revelations that have come about since, show our progress or lack of towards the important goal of gender equality, because I think that that's quite a big issue in Trump's presidency and the sorts of values that he represents that maybe thus far in the conversation tonight we haven't really touched on. So I'd like to hear the panel's views on that.
Oh, thank you. And it might be worth actually taking that final question first. There has been a lot about comparing, on reflection, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and in fact, throughout the election, they were both asked about each other. It did become quite personal. We kind of picked up on the election cycle being seen to be taken to quite a low level in terms of personal attacks rather than policy. And some of that is arguably centered around gender. In her book, What Happened, Hillary Clinton did bring this out as quite a strong theme. Is that something that, Kate, you feel continues to be relevant and shows progress or lack of with a candidate like Trump being electable against a candidate like Hillary Clinton?
Mm-hmm. I have to separate Hillary Clinton's loss from Donald Trump's rhetoric around women. I think they're 2 separate issues. I don't believe that Hillary Clinton lost because she was a woman. I believe she lost because she was a bad candidate who didn't campaign in 3 major states that she should have campaigned in. I mean, I think it's pretty technical, actually, why Hillary Clinton lost. I think your point about Donald Trump's rhetoric and the fact that people are willing to overlook it and be okay with it is the major issue. Once Trump came out with his line that I don't even want to repeat, but about Mexicans being rapists. I mean, that was it for me. I was done. There was no way of justifying that ever again. And then we got so much more about his attacks on minorities and women. This is what really concerns me, is the fact that that rhetoric has been made okay. I have to separate that, though, from why she lost. It's not obvious to me that she lost because she was a woman in any way. It's also hard for me to buy that Obama was elected into 2 terms as America's first black president, but people couldn't get their heads around a woman. I think it was her as a candidate that was more problematic. Do you want to just do that question, or do you want to do the other questions as well?
No, feel free to address the others.
It's so interesting that you think that the Republicans have hijacked the Constitution and patriotism. That's because, I mean, I'm not sure how to respond to that, in the sense that I think the Democrats think that they probably have a monopoly on those things. Donald Trump, in particular, has been very good at saying, if you're not with me, you're against me. But I think, again, he's kind of an independent acting within this party. And you do have a lot of Republicans, you said Bill Kristol was on campus last night, speaking out loudly against that. But you're definitely right that if a Republican is going to use that line, it's probably going to be connected to the Constitution, something like gun rights, something like patriotism in that way. When Democrats use that line, it's usually far more driven by compassion, but actually it's really not compassion at all. I'm thinking back to Obama's, you didn't build that. You know, you owe me. You owe me because of what I'm doing for you. So I think it exists on both sides, just a really interesting perspective to hear. And then there was another question about what the Democrats can do. I think a lot of people would say that they should challenge Trump at his own game and put up someone like Bernie Sanders. I could be totally wrong, but I just instinctively disagree with that. I think not necessarily a centrist, but somebody who's someone who's more moderate and optimistic and hopeful about the future. I don't think America is enjoying this terrible state of despair that everyone is in. Everyone. No one's enjoying this. Even the Trump supporters, genuinely. I think everyone feels beat up. Everyone feels tired. If you had a interesting, dynamic, energetic Democrat who could appeal to Republicans, who wasn't further to the left of Hillary Clinton, but slightly further to the right, I think that person would win.
Do I have to do all 3 at the same time? I feel like there's a lot going on.
Choose whatever you would like to go with.
Okay. To start with the patriotism thing, I think it was interesting to watch the DNC convention in the summer. There was a lot, they had a Gold Star family on stage. There was a lot about how great America is. Michelle Obama saying, this is a great country. It's not terrible. We don't need to fix it. It's amazing as it is. And all the flags and the balloons. I think you're right. I think the Republican Party did have a monopoly, a political monopoly on using the Constitution in their campaigns, mostly because the Democrats do tend to attack things like the Second Amendment. You know, it is a big part of many Democratic campaigns. But I think Donald Trump saying how terrible America was gave the Democrats back this patriotism and this wonder for what America is, which was really interesting. What was the first question again?
So the first question was about what strategy should the Democrats be taking for 2020?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't think Elizabeth Warren could win. I think Bill Kristol was here last night, and he was saying it's so easy. Donald Trump's approval rating is at 37%, which is a historical record for this time in the presidency. All they need to do is stand up and say, look how terrible he is. I think we need a centrist, maybe a woman again. I would love Kamala Harris or Kirsten Gillibrand to stand up and say, how terrible is this? We can fix this. The Republican Party is not functioning properly. Give it back to us. I think that's all it takes. But the Democratic Party has been shambolic. It's been crazy. I just don't understand. I guess it's the schisms brought up with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and we can see how different lots of the factions in the party are, but really, we just need one unifying candidate and one message, not Trump, literally.
And so, Anna, you suggest kind of on the final point, the question about gender equality and the rhetoric around that, that a female candidate could win in 2020. You don't think that the current dialogue and, in some ways, Trump's win indicates that that's not possible right now, and there's not been as much progress as we think?
I don't agree that Hillary Clinton didn't win because she was a woman. I agree with you. I just don't think that was what it was. I think she likes to say it, and she said it after she lost to Obama. She said it now. I think it's a bit self-pitying, to be honest. I mean, I love her, but I don't think that's why she lost. I think it was really dispiriting to see how little people cared that Donald Trump was a sexual harasser. In the wake of the Harvey Weinstein allegations and everything that's happened since, to know that a man like that is our president is horrifying to me. And the fact that the American, so many women didn't care is horrible. But I don't think misogyny is keeping a woman away from the presidency. I just think Hillary Clinton wasn't good enough.
And John Clark, on any of those in any order?
So I think Kate and Anna pretty much hit it on the head on the gender question. I would add a couple things in response to the patriotism issue. Historically, I think we can probably trace that back to the 1972 election and McGovern running as a fairly far-left Democrat against Richard Nixon. And at that time, the Vietnam War was a fiercely controversial issue in American society. The Democrats were anti-war, and that allowed Nixon to cast himself, and thus the Republican Party, as the party of supporting the military and being patriotic against America's enemies. Although there was an interesting inversion in this past election. Previously, Republicans were sort of the establishment status quo party, painting with a broad brush, and the Democrats were the things are bad, we need to change them party. And as Anna said, last cycle there was this weird inversion where it was the Republicans saying things have gone down the drain, we need to make radical changes and tear everything up, and it was the Democrats saying, no, we've made a lot of progress, let's keep it going. It was the Democrats bringing out the Gold Star family and Trump attacking them. And throughout Trump's campaign, he said many derogatory things about our veterans, about our soldiers, about our generals, about our intelligence community, compared the CIA to Nazi Germany, and for the Republicans, who had traditionally been the pro-defense party, to veer in that direction was quite a reversal. And then on the final issue of what Democrats should do, I'm sympathetic to the view that a centrist is probably the way to go. I think if Joe Biden had thrown his hat in the ring in 2016, he would have had a much better chance than Hillary. He has the blue-collar, Midwestern sort of gravitas and earthiness. Hillary, whether rightly or wrongly, came off as a New York elitist, whereas Joe Biden is one of the best in the business at summoning up that high dudgeon of real burning indignation against fakers and clowns like Trump. And so, although it will still be a couple of years for the 2020 Democratic field to shape up, I sincerely hope Joe Biden is taking his vitamins in case we need him.
And I think with that we have time for just one more question before we close. Got lots of hands. I think I'm going to take just in the center here.
Hi, I'm Ginny. I'm in Queens. I have a question about the role you think freedom of speech and the alleged defense of freedom of speech played in the election, and whether you think that's something that we can solve by the next election, because in my view it played a pretty large role.
That's a great question. I think this is much bigger than the American election. This is a real battle of ideas that's playing out in halls like this, frankly. Actually, this is a real hotbed for it. As someone who wholeheartedly embraces free speech to the radical point, I have absolutely no problem with people saying what they want to say. What we so often forget about free speech, especially in the political realm, is that there are still consequences for it. You can say whatever you want, and you shouldn't be in prison for it, but there are consequences to what people say. And we absolutely have to get more of a grip on fake news. I mean, this is a totally different panel discussion, but we have to get a grip on what is genuine fake information being put out into the public domain. At the same time, I would really challenge those who are reporting the real news to not rise to the bait of Donald Trump and his minions. His minions are that very, very small fraction of people and his supporters who have popped their heads out, who now think it's okay to say some pretty messed up white nationalist stuff. When we rise to it, we empower them. When CNN makes CNN's whole news agenda meta by talking about Donald Trump's attacks on CNN, they are allowing him to win. So we have to address it, but at the same time, free speech also means letting things roll off your back, and I think that has to be learned at the very, very top level as well.
I mean, it's been interesting because Donald Trump, he advocated so voraciously for free speech. I mean, the things he said, you couldn't get away with before Donald Trump. And he got elected because of it, because lots of people thought, this is a man who's not afraid to say what, he thinks, what a lot of us think. But at the same time, like we were talking about before, he has been talking about trying to curtail the free press. So this is a really interesting paradox within this administration. I think it did play a large part. Like you were saying earlier, his attitude was really important in getting him elected, and I think a lot of that was him saying whatever he wanted to say. So I think you're right, it did play a large role.
I think closely related to the issue of free speech is the issue of political correctness, which has really been a touchstone of controversy in the United States. And that's something that stretches back at least to the 90s. And I remember when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, I would hear people say, well, I'm not for political correctness, I'm not politically correct. But what they meant back then by political correctness was for people to police speech independently of the intention behind it. So for example, if someone came out in public and said, I think disabled people should have more services available to them, and someone shouted them down and said, it's differently abled, it's not disabled, that's a slur, you're a bigot. That was something that I think the overwhelming majority of Americans thought was nonsense, because here's someone honestly trying to do something good for people in this community, and they're being shunned over a purely semantic issue. What Donald Trump has done is a really tragic muddying of the waters that has conflated that kind of political correctness with slurs and demagoguery, such that now I see people on Twitter and even in real life use the N-word against black people and then say, well, this is just freedom of speech. You're too politically correct. You're a snowflake. Why can't you take this? And in so doing, Trump hijacked that reservoir of resentment against political correctness by the old definition and weaponized that to get people supporting this really toxic, virulent rhetoric targeting minorities and liberals and basically anyone who opposed Trump.
Well, a really interesting question to finish on, and thank you to everyone who did offer questions tonight. Hopefully, after the panel, both in here and down in the bar, you can continue to discuss amongst yourselves and with some of the panelists. And a big thank you to Kate, Anna, and John Clark for being here tonight. And I really have nothing more to add other than a notice that tomorrow night's debate starts at 7:30 and is on the motion, "This House has lost faith in faith." And then on Friday, we have a pub quiz in the Union Bar with Eric Monkman and Bobby Seagull taking place. So do keep in touch on the mailings for all of those, and thank you for coming tonight.